like a bell cut.
Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another first impressions video, with today's game being somewhat of a cult classic in the form of Pandora's Tower, which originally saw release in Japan in May of 2011 before coming out in the PAL territories in April of 2012 and then finally getting a North American release one whole year after that in April of 2013. So the story for Pandora's Tower sees the main protagonist Aaron fleeing from the Illyrian army with his lover Eleanor after she is struck by a curse which slowly begins to turn her into a monster. Accompanied by a mysterious character called Mavda, they journey to the 13 towers located in Okeanos in an attempt to break the curse and restore Eleanor back to her normal self before the curse completely takes over her and turns her into a monster for good with no way of reversing it.
This way, quick.
So if you're new to the series, what I do is I play a game for around about an hour and a half and then summarize my first impressions on what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it plays like, what kind of content and lifespan I think it's got, and whether it's going to be a game that I return back to complete and then give it a final grade. Now, when I first started playing Pandora's Tower, the first thing that struck me was the production value of the game. The introduction movie and then the game graphics when you came into the actual main game, I felt were very impressive for the Wii. I felt the quality of the intro really set the game up quite well, and I felt the designs of the characters and the graphical quality of them once you're actually within the game is very, very good for the Wii. I felt the area that I explored, the first tower, looked pretty good as well, and the monsters generally looked pretty decent too. Now, I felt the performance of the game was actually quite good as well. Now, I have looked at a few reviews since then, and it has been criticized for having drops in frame rate at time, and a lot of other publications said that it had pretty poor textures. Now, I actually didn't really experience any of this, and I genuinely think the game is a really good looking game within the Wii's library. So moving on to the sound effects and music next, and I've said something similar in the past to this, that I feel RPGs and adventure style games tend to have some of the best soundtracks around. I always think some of the more creative developers tend to put out these games, and that really passes over into the music, because I tend to feel it can be quite emotive, quite dramatic, and just genuinely be some of the better music on consoles. And I feel Pandora's Tower does a pretty good job here. It's got some quite dramatic themes when you're going through the tower and when you're fighting characters, and you need this because of the game's time mechanic that's in place. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in gameplay, but the quality of music seems very high. There are some slower paced tunes as well to give it a nice mix. And in terms of sound effects, it's pretty good here as well, because all of the battle sounds within the tower are fantastic. The monsters sound pretty good as well. I don't feel the voice acting is perhaps as good as it could have been. Eleanor's voice is a little bit iffy in my opinion, and the main character Aaron doesn't actually speak any of his lines himself. Now, he doesn't actually have text, so it's not a silent protagonist like Zelda, but it does mean that he comes across as not really having much of a personality or character. That being said, what I'll do is give you some examples of the music within the game. So moving on to the gameplay next, and there is quite a bit to say here in all fairness. The game revolves around collecting various different types of monster flesh to bring back to Eleanor for her to eat. Yes, that's right, the young, pretty, damsel in distress style character has to actually eat the flesh of the monsters that Aaron kills to slow down the curse from taking over her. The regular monster flesh that you get from standard enemies will only temporarily halt the effects of the curse, and it's the actual master flesh from all of the bosses that you'll face in the towers that you'll need to collect to permanently remove the curse from Eleanor. In terms of the controls, you've got a choice of either Wii Remote and Nunchuck or the Classic Pro controller. For the sake of my footage, at least anyway, I decided I was going to use the Classic Pro controller. I actually prefer playing pretty much all games with the standard controller now over the Wii Remote and Nunchuck, and I did find it actually worked relatively well. You move around with the left analog stick and you move the cursor on the screen with the right analog stick. You attack by pressing the A button, and you can launch your chain with the R button. You can tear at the enemy and draw in items with the B button. Pressing Y will let you swing an object or an enemy whilst it's bound, and pressing the X button will pick up or examine any of the objects that you come across. You can also evade attacks from the enemies by holding the L button and moving the left analog stick. Simply holding the L button will block, and using the D-pad will let you select and use items. In general, I think, to be fair, the game does control pretty well. I think the main things that you'll have to overcome with the game is the fact that there's no lock-on mechanic, certainly not that I've seen, at least thus far in the game, for the enemies. So that might be something that perhaps frustrates some people. I think moving the cursor with the R button or the Wii Remote, if you're using that kind of control scheme, may be something that some people find a little bit iffy and a little bit fiddly. But I think once you get used to it, it actually controls well. The other thing is the fact that the camera view changes automatically as you progress through areas, similar to like the older Resident Evil style games. Obviously the game's completely 3D, but you have zero control in the camera. Now in terms of combat, it's fairly straightforward in all fairness. You can just go up to the regular enemies and you can smash away at them with your normal attacks, no problem. Once you've defeated them, you can actually zoom in with the R button, and this lets you harvest different items by targeting different parts of the monster's body, which I think is actually quite a novel touch. The chain item, I should say, comes into effect much more in the boss fights, as it's used to pull at them and charge your chain gauge so that you can execute a powerful tear attack, and this deals massive damage, certainly from what I experienced with the first boss at least anyway. Whilst I don't feel the game perhaps plays as well as a Zelda game, something like Skyward Sword, which is obviously a brilliant game on the Wii, I think on my first impressions it actually plays relatively well, and the chain mechanic does actually add a bit of variety to the gameplay. One final thing I haven't pointed out yet on the gameplay is the meter in the bottom left hand corner, the circle that slowly depletes as you go through the towers, because if this completely empties, then Eleanor will be turned into a monster permanently. If it's running low, you need to exit the towers and give her some monster flesh to fill it back up. So moving on to content and lifespan next, and there are 13 towers within the game, so I thought to myself it's probably got around 13 hours of playthrough time, but I thought I'd actually check this before I did the video, and actually on average the game can take anywhere from 20 up to 35 hours for a standard playthrough, and it says for 100% completion it may even take 50 hours to play. Now there are multiple endings as well, so the game definitely will have replay value. Assuming you enjoy the way it plays, it would definitely be a game that you would want to see more than one ending to. So I do feel in terms of content and lifespan there is quite a lot probably to see here. As always, that leaves me with my two final questions. Is Pandora's Tower a game I will revisit and potentially complete? And what final grade am I going to give it based on my first impressions? In terms of whether I will play this game more, absolutely. I think it's the kind of game that I'll need to play 2 or 3 more towers to really grasp whether it's got enough in terms of gameplay progression to keep me interested until the end of the game. In terms of what final grade I'm going to give it, this was actually quite a tough one overall, I think. In terms of production value and presentation, I felt it was absolutely fantastic. One of the best games on the Wii. I don't really understand why some reviewers sort of cited the visuals as an issue. I feel sound and music very good as well, and I feel there's probably quite a lot of content and replay value here as well. I didn't mention you can actually upgrade your weapon as you progress through the game as well by collecting items from the enemy, so I do think there's quite a lot to see. It's just a question really of whether the gameplay evolves at all as you progress through the game. So I'm going to give Pandora's Tower a fantastic A-, the highest ranked game that we have taken a look at so far in my first impression series. Of course, you have to remember that I'm basing my scores on the first hour and a half of the gameplay, and it's not a review of the entire game. Now, like always, if your opinions differ or if you agree with me, let me know down below. Just like I want to hear your general thoughts of Pandora's Tower as well. Is it up there as one of the best games on the Wii, or is it perhaps a little bit underwhelming overall? As always, let me know down below. Now, of course, if you've liked this video, consider subscribing, keeping up to date with all of my other videos. Liking and sharing will always help. And if you want to become a channel member and be in with a chance of winning a brand new game every month, then possibly consider that as well. That is it for this week. Like always, I'll be back with another first impressions video next week. So until then, goodbye for now.